My father came from Greci in 1929. I'm Joe DioGuardi. I'm the oldest of Joe DioGuardi Sr.'s 3 children. I've got my brother Dick, he's 5 years younger. My sister Angela, we call her Angel. She's 3 years younger than I am, or 2 years younger. Ever since I was a young man being raised in the Bronx in what I knew as an Italian-American neighborhood, I always felt there was something special about the kind of Italian that I was, because I remember many times my father speaking a language to his mother, and in the presence of other Italians, where they would turn to each other and say, boy, they're really speaking that crazy dialect, Albanese. And I grew up thinking that I was from Italy, because I knew, or at least I was from a family that was from Italy, because I knew my father was born in a town near Naples, which we know as Greci, in the province of Avellino. And he was born there in 1913. He came to America in 1929. And my mother comes from a town on the east side of Italy, because Naples is on the west side, and it's a town that's just above Bari called Giovinazzo. So growing up in the Italian-American experience in America, I felt there was something different about my father's side of the family, because it had to do with the language. As I got older, I remember in the late 40s and 50s, before we get to me being too much older, as we went to picnics in Orchard Beach in the Bronx and Pelham Bay in the Bronx, inevitably my father would hear someone speaking his so-called dialect, and he'd go up and start chatting with them, and as soon as they started talking the Albanian language, which we now know as our Bresh, the old Albanian language which survives in Italy today in 51 Albanian-speaking villages in Italy today, they would grab each other, kiss each other, and I still have many recollections of how my father was so deliriously happy that he met people that spoke this old Albanian language, and their first words would be 2 Albanian words. My father would say, "Gjaku I shprishu," as he kissed them and hugged them. And Gjaku is the word for blood in Albanian, and shprishu means dispersed. The Albanian people have had a history, as we know, having done work in the Balkans since I was a congressman with my wife Shirley, of dispersal. They've been a people who have been chased out of their country by the Turks in the 15th century. And after 450 years of Ottoman occupation, World War I comes, and they still had problems with Greeks and Slavs, the Serbs, the Macedonians, and then later on with communists. So that they've been a people who have been kept off balance for the last 600 years. But that word, Gjaku I shprishu, those 2 words meant a lot to me, because it showed me that my father was reaching out to his path, that he found the people from his town that, like himself, were again dispersed. And in 1929, my father's dispersal was as a result of economics, not political repression, because Italy did provide an asylum for the Albanian people since the year 1461, which is when they went to Greci, and then most Albanians came when the Turks overran Albania in 1488. So you're talking about some 600 years. But this dispersal was an economic one, because during the Great Depression, which hit Italy as well, maybe worse than the United States, there was no work, was no jobs. And I remember my father saying that his cousins, the females, 2 of them, had to be put in a convent because they had big families and they couldn't afford to feed these individuals. They were starving. And one of them ended up in America, and we know her today. She just died a few years ago, as Sister Cecilia Tosi. And Tosi is the name of my grandmother, Angelina Tosi. My grandfather was Nicola DioGuardi. And we'll talk about that later on today, because we're here in Canton to see their descendants. And why are they here? And why are we here? Well, it was about a year or 2 ago that I got a call from Betsy Sabaid. She is one of my 3rd cousins, She has Albanian heritage she'll talk about in a while, and we'll see her during the day. And she had seen an article in National Geographic when Shirley and I brought them to Italy to show them, and they were in disbelief that there were so many Albanians in Italy, because they wanted to focus on the Kosovo War in 1999, and they were thinking they'd cover the refugees that were coming from Kosovo to Italy, but didn't know there was an indigenous population of Albanians from 600 years ago. So that was the first outreach to me that connected us to Canton, because Betsy's family came to Canton before she moved to California. And then maybe a year later, I get an email from Bob Peterson, who is a Danish American who married one of my cousins, Dina, and we'll see her later on. And he did a great job in tracing the roots of the people from Greci back as many as 10, 11, 12 generations, 300 to 400 years, because being an expert in computers, he managed to put on a database all the birth and death records and marriage records from Greci, so we have it. And it was in talking to him, and he sends me a 13-page listing of my ancestors from Greci on my father's side, going back, 300 or 400 years, and I gave it to my brother Dick and my sister Angel, and that's where we began thinking that, we need to connect. Here we connected with the past on a piece of paper. Why don't we go and meet the cousins that we know are in Canton, Ohio? So we're here today. And why are there so many people from Greci and Canton, Ohio today? Well, as I said before, the people who came from Italy came here looking for jobs. And it's obvious talking to Dina and Betsy and Bob that the people here in Canton and other suburbs like Magnolia were attracted to companies that were making bricks, steel companies. And I guess when the first Albanians from Greci came here in the 1890s, they found a good livelihood, especially compared to what was there in Italy. And don't forget, where Greci is just an agricultural area, and the subsistence level was basically on growing food and selling it to the local Italians in the local villages. But when they came here, I guess they had a pretty good living, and they started to send that signal back to Greci. And sure enough, Bob told me that on the ships that they came on, he saw on the manifest that they were heading for Canton, not New York, so that they already knew this was their destination. In the beginning, I guess some found New York and heard about jobs and came out here. Well, over the years, many people from Greci ended up in the Canton area and the suburbs because of those jobs, and they've stayed here. And today, I'm told by Bob Peterson, there may be as many as 400 or 500 cousins, the Greci cousins, we'll call them, that are second, third, fourth, who knows. But we know by the names because the names are very prominent. The family names of Rex, of Pucci, of DioGuardi, of Sasso, even Regis Philbin's mother. And believe it or not, Regis Philbin's mother, Philomena Boschia, she wasn't born in Greci, but her father was, and she was born here just after they came to America. She was born in Manhattan, and we've now traced Regis Philbin's roots back to Greci some 300 years, and that's another story that's going to be told hopefully soon. But we have here now so many cousins with these names, and some of these names, believe it or not, go back 600 years. Don't forget, well, I haven't told you the original story of Greci, but it was basically settled by the soldiers of the great Albanian general, George Castriati, known as Skanderbeg, because he was invited to what was then the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily to help ward off the French who were invading the lower Italian peninsula. You have to remember that Italy didn't become a country until 1861. We're talking about 600 years ago when you had the Kingdom of Venice and Rome and everything else, and the Papal States. So here we have now the great general going back to defend his people against the Turks, but he leaves 2,000 soldiers in Greci. And the names of those 2,000 soldiers exist today. The Puccis, the Rexes, the Tosis, the Boschas. In fact, I told Regis Philbin, you come, from an Albanian captain from 600 years ago. And he just was mesmerized by the story and wants to hear more. And he'll see this tape as well. So here we are today in a reunion in Canton, Ohio, to meet our cousins. But I go back to those words that I told National Geographic, and they renamed their story Albanians, a people undone, which was their translation of Jako I Shprishur, a people that was dispersed, that my father found on the picnic areas of Pelham Bay and Orchard Beach that we're finding here today. So the theme of this tape is Jako Shprishur, that we're finding our lost blood. We came here last night, we met with a few of the cousins. We're going to meet today with maybe 150 or 200. And Shirley, who's an expert in oral history, my wife Shirley Cloyes, she'll be interviewing some of the older members of the family in their 90s that still speak Albanian or Albrecht fluently, so we have that on tape as well. So with that, I have my brother here on my right side, and he's got a mic, so we'll start with him. I'm sure even at 5 years younger than me, he remembers how Dad was proud to meet Albanian people. And even when I became a congressman, how proud he was when he realized that he was now connecting to Albanians across the Adriatic that he never knew about, because he was raised in a village where they went only to the 4th or 5th grade, so they didn't hear the study. They didn't know the history of the Albanian people on the other side. And here, my becoming a congressman, being lobbied by Albanians who found my father by accident speaking Albanian, and that's how this thing came out. Here he's now connecting to Albanians across the Adriatic, and I hear him speaking Albanian to people from Yugoslavia. And that's when I knew this was not a dialect of Italian, that this was another language completely. It was the Albanian language, which hasn't changed much in 600 years. There have been some changes. But any recollections that you have on that, Rich?
Well, if I remember correctly, the story was at one of your campaigns in 1984. I remember Dad was there, and his sister Ida was there. And he was just in the background speaking with Aunt Ida. And he was speaking in the Gegida. We always called it Gegida, but that's Albrecht. And I think one of the Albanian people in the community heard him speaking with Aunt Ida, and he went up and he started to talk to Dad, and he asked, well, why are you here? And Dad said, well, Joe is my son. And when the Albanian in the audience heard that Joe DioGuardi running for Congress was his son, he couldn't believe it. And then I think all those community Albanians started to come to the future campaigns and kind of hooked on to you.
Came to my house to tell me about Kosovo.
And that was the beginning of, I think, you helping them out in their issues and problems they had in Europe. I always remember that story. And, as far as Dad, I remember my younger days working in a grocery store in the Bronx, and Dad had friends like Rocco Leone, and there was also another one, Leonard. I forget his last name, but Lenny was from also.
Yes, I forget that last name.
If not Greci, maybe Ariano.
Caraturo, Lenny Caraturo.
Caraturo. Yes. And so I have recollections of Dad's friends when I was working in the grocery store. But being the youngest, I didn't pick up too much on the language.
But you remember him speaking the language to Grandma.
All the time.
And what's the Albanian word for nose?
That nose is hunda.
Right. Okay, so
and bread is buka.
Right.
Yeah, so as a matter of fact, I have Albanian clients today. I'm an accountant, and oftentimes I make a connection with, I know a couple of words, so they're amazed. I know what the word for nose and bread is.
You also know a couple of others too, but we're not going to say what they are.
Exactly. That's right.
That was on your last video.
Well, Angel, you have, I'm sure, the same recollections, and you remember Grandma. In fact, you brought some pictures here, and we're going to take these pictures later, but here's my mother and father being married in the Bronx in 1939 in Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church, and we were baptized in that Italian neighborhood church, which is now the Little Italy of the Bronx. We went to a neighboring school called St. Martin of Tours, but there's a picture of, and many of these people come from Greci. Okay, we'll take pictures later. And my sister was nice enough to bring the passport of my grandmother, Angelina Tosi, with one of her daughters here. And here it does say that she comes from Greci. And I think it says she's born in 1892.
1892.
So we will take a copy of this and put this in too. But this is the original passport from Angelina. as she was coming to America. And here is Angelina many years later in the Bronx Park. You can see how well dressed she is over here. But we'll take a lot of pictures and still shots later.
They took a lot of pride in their appearance.
They did, I
My
remember.
grandmother. One of my earliest recollections is we grew up in an Italian-American neighborhood, and most of my friends' grandparents spoke Italian. And every time they were around my grandmother or my dad, and they would be conversing, my grandmother and my father, my friends would say, "That doesn't sound like Italian." And I'd say, "Well, it is. It's a dialect of Italian." I mean, I had no clue that any of this Albanian connection existed. But later on, it was interesting to find it was not Italian at all, which my friends had known early on. And we all picked up a few words from...
In fact, I remember when we walked into, because we had apartments in the same apartment building on 2164 Prospect Avenue, where I was born, where we were raised until we moved to Westchester in 1957. And my Aunt Fanny, my father had 3 sisters, and the oldest was Philomena, Aunt Fanny. And my cousin Rose, her only child, a daughter, just a few years older than me, next door. So we'd go sometimes next door, and they'd be chattering away in Albanian, and as soon as we walked in, they probably didn't want us to hear.
That's because Joe
too
and my
much.
cousin Rose were very competitive, and they never wanted Joe to know what was going on with
Well,
Rose.
whatever it was, but I always remember these words, "Mustoi mizgye," which meant don't say anything. Mustoi, must means don't, thoi means talk, mizgye, nothing. And those words exist today because I've used this in the in Kosovo, and those are exactly the words you use today if you wanted to tell an Albanian, don't say anything, mustoi mizgye. And here, as a kid, I remember that because my grandmother and aunts used it. You remember that too?
I remember that.
Well, we had an upbringing that was very much European, and the 3 of us had responsibilities in the store. Dad had a grocery store, vegetable store in the Bronx. He worked very hard, and we helped him. But he returned it by making sure that we were well educated, and that's why we're here today. And in a way, we're paying something back to his heritage. Not only am I doing that with Shirley because of our human rights work, but we as a family are here today, and it wasn't easy for us to leave our families and the others that are going to be here today, especially from California. But we feel that we owe something to the Albanian people to tell this story and to get it out to other Albanians across the Adriatic today, that there are people in America that still are proud of their heritage, that they come from a village where people today in Canton, Ohio, are still speaking Albanian, some of the older people I talked about. So I think this is an important connection in a human sense. In an historical sense, it's important because the Albanian people have been buried by communism, have been buried by the history as told by their adversaries, the Greeks and the Slavs, and have been buried by the Ottoman occupation for 450 years. 600 years ago, all Albanians were Christian, mostly Catholic. All the names were like Latin names, DioGuardi, Boscia, Sasso. It was the 450 years that they were coerced into a new religion, and many of them are blessed by that new religion today. There's no problem with religion. 70% of the Albanian people in the Balkans profess the Islamic faith, and 30% are Christian, and about 2/3 of that Christian are Orthodox and 1/3 Catholic. And they're very at peace with themselves. They intermarry. So religion is not an issue. But I wanted to make sure that we told this story because today there are Americans and others around the world who don't know who the Albanian people are, and this will give them one more facet of this story. A good sign. A good sign in many ways. My father's name, DioGuardi, and then the Pucci family, the Rex and Sassos. But I know that in my family there are Pucci, Rexes going back, and certainly DioGuardi. Now what's interesting is they used a small G. On my father's birth certificate, this is the way the name is spelled, but yet my brother, sister, and I, and my brother Richard is here, my sister Angel, we use a capital G because in Catholic schools they changed it. So here the DioGuardis here are using the small G, and the ones in New York are using the big G. So there's a little bit of a difference, but it's the same family.
They changed it. They changed it to conform to the Italian spelling.
Come here. Len, come here.
They didn't realize that all Albanian names were originally Italian, Illyrian.